Rejoice, gamers, the war is over. The dark ages of our video games art discourse have ended, and in this new age of enlightenment, we can all finally collectively tip our fedoras in union and proudly say, yes, video games are art. That's right, normies. It's the dawning of the age of the gamer. Fuck you, Bosch. Eat shit, Picasso. There's a new cultural juggernaut on the scene. But we as victors would be remiss not to pay tribute to the fallen heroes who paved the way to this new utopia. See, you kids might not know, but we who fought in the trenches remember a time when we had to play our video games in secret to avoid ridicule from the social elite. And the games that failed to reach mainstream acceptance often fell into obscurity, buried on the battlefield in unmarked graves. That is why I am taking it upon myself to celebrate these relics. Games that maybe you and I know about, but have aged enough that it's highly likely that most people born after the year, say, 2000, have never seen. Now, my framing of this video as a battle is more than just an exercise in performative irony. Our first casualty in this war is in itself a story of war. A game I would struggle to call obscure because it was published by industry juggernaut Nintendo, but one that has definitely fallen on the wayside of the cultural lexicon. A game that captures that pioneering artistic spirit and expresses it in the most over-the-top and batshit crazy way. Ladies and gentlemen, Sin and Punishment. So if Nintendo, Sega, and Sony were the alpha males of the video game tribe in the late 90s, then Development Studio Treasure was the true Sigma male. A studio that played by its own rules and made the games they wanted to make, even if they weren't quite, quote-unquote, commercially viable. In 1997, Masato Maegawa, president of Treasure, approached his team with a pitch that I choose to believe was met with gasps of disbelief and quiet murmurs of disapproval. See, Maegawa had been inspired by the N64 controller, which I firmly believe is probably the worst controller design of all time. Up until then, almost all games developed for the system had utilized holding the right side of the controller, which was standard practice after the release of Super Mario 64, but Maegawa thought it might be a fun exercise to design a game around holding the left side of the controller. He and his team pitched the idea to Nintendo, who accepted it, but not without reservations. The director on the Nintendo side of development, Hiroshi Yamagami, tried to explain to Maegawa that the left side of the N64 controller was considered unnatural, only utilized by deviants and societal pariahs. He expressed concern as well that audiences would be too stupid to discern this new way of play, to which Maegawa replied, "Eat shit, nerd," and then made the game anyway, and thus, Sin and Punishment was born. I am gonna be serious for a second. I actually have a lot of respect for Treasure and Yamagami, despite how much I'm making fun of him. I've always appreciated developers, and artists in general, that are willing to take risks with their products. Sin and Punishment is a rail shooter, meaning that the player character is moved along a set path through the stage, with the player only being able to maneuver the set on screen rather than being able to freely explore the level. Almost like a translation of a shmup into a 3D environment. Now, this was never a very popular genre, with Star Fox really being the only franchise that saw any mainstream success. But this was the game that Treasure wanted to make, so fuck it, they made it. And Yamagami, despite his disagreements in design philosophy, never overreached and forced the Treasure team to adhere to his or Nintendo's wishes. He and Treasure argued a lot about the game's difficulty in particular. Yamagami thought the game was just too damn hard, but also understood Treasure was known for making difficult games. In the end, he won, as the game did receive a decrease in difficulty, but I think he's a good example of effective management. Work with the team you have instead of trying to change them. The game took an unusually long time to develop, mainly because the N64's technical architecture was a bit of a mess, and the Treasure team in charge of development was not experienced working in a three-dimensional setting. The game finally released in 2000, near the end of the console's life cycle, to meager sales. Despite having full English voice acting, the game only released in Japan, only being known in the West to weebs and import gamers. It remained in relative obscurity until the release of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, when Saki, the main character of the game, appeared as an assist trophy, and the game finally released in the West on the Wii Virtual Console. Now, I've always held a conspiracy theory that Saki was only included in the game because Nintendo saw the success that came to Fire Emblem in the West after the inclusion of Marth and Roy in Melee, and they wanted to try and reignite that spark of weeb fire and sell more copies of the game's sequel, Sin and Punishment: Star Successor, that was due to release a couple years later. Now, Star Successor fucking rules, and I will definitely make a video about it at some point, but unfortunately at the time, the weebs did not answer the call to arms, and once more, Sin and Punishment was met with poor sales and fell back into relative obscurity. So what is the deal with Sin and Punishment? I mean, why am I lecturing you about it in 2021? Well, the game fucking slaps, that's why. Treasure was known for adding a borderline absurd level of action to their games, and they were not fucking around with Sin and Punishment. This game is like a tsunami of stimulation. A miasma of projectile vomited at you by enemies constantly prancing around the screen, while the set pieces behind them become constantly more bizarre and absurd, shifting and transforming as the game progresses, as you try your absolute best to keep track of yourself amidst all of the madness. Now that may sound like a criticism, but it's not. Sin and Punishment really captures that anime feel of over-the-top action that other mediums tend to fall short on. I should also mention that despite the game getting a difficulty decrease in comparison to its original design, the game is still pretty tough. If you're not used to playing shmups or bullet hells, then the game might feel inaccessible. However, fret not, baby gamers. I have two silver linings to offer you. One, the game does have an easy mode available from the start. Now, I am no easy mode hater. I think all games should have one, so the game is accessible to anyone who's interested in experiencing it. But I do think you should at least try and play this game on normal. The main change in easy mode is that the number of enemies and projectiles on screen is reduced in most scenes, but there are also a couple of neat set pieces and boss phases that are exclusive to normal mode that I think are worth experiencing. But if that's not your vibe, then easy mode is a good alternative. 2. The game, from start to finish, only takes about an hour to complete. Most of the experience is derived from failing and restarting. This loops back to the development cycle for this game. Because the Treasure team was so small and they had such difficulties with the programming, a lot of content was probably cut or just never addressed to begin with. Now that is just me speculating, as the cutting room floor doesn't have much info about this game. But I think it's an educated guess. The game received a lot of criticism on release because of its short length. Now, as an adult with a full-time job and increasingly diminished time to play games, I appreciate shorter, tighter experiences in general, but I can agree that an hour is pretty damn short, especially for a game that released for full price. That said, this is 2021. You'll probably be playing this on the Nintendo Online service, or a darker, more secret method. So the length versus price point comparison isn't as important anymore. So even if the game looks intimidating to you, just give it a try. At worst, you'll lose a couple of hours. Listen, if you were able to understand the Sin and Punishment plot on your first playthrough, then you are some kind of savant that needs to be studied in a top-secret government facility and cloned to create a new generation of super intelligent super soldiers. Seriously, the story is borderline nonsensical. At least on the surface. There's actually a fair bit of background and exposition that clarifies most of the plot, but the problem is that it's never presented to you. Maybe it's in the manual? I don't know, the game only released in Japan, so I don't know if an English manual even exists. Never fear though, Dolphin Head will take care of you. I guess if you're intrigued by what I've shown you so far, and you are really actually considering playing the game, and really don't want the story spoiled, go ahead and leave now. But I don't think spoilers actually make a huge difference in this context. Anyway, let's break it down. Okay, so the game revolves around a three-party conflict. In Corner A are the Ruffians, a host of creatures bioengineered by Japanese scientists to help combat global food shortages. Now, as is tradition with lab-grown organisms, they go berserk and begin terrorizing Japan. By the way, the game takes place in 2007, aka the distant future. In Corner B, we have the Armed Volunteers, a gang of militants sent by the US to help the Japanese government combat the ruffian threat. Led by legendary stud Brad, they predictably go mad with power and begin oppressing the Japanese people. Finally, in Corner C is the Savior Group, a plucky team of rebels featuring our two-player characters, Saki and Irene, as well as the leader, Achi, who has promised quote-unquote salvation to all of her followers, presumably from the Armed Volunteers, but I think one should also be skeptical of a woman with magic powers offering quote-unquote salvation. That might mean something different to her than it does to you. Anyway, the three factions clash with each other in increasingly dire, bloody conflict. The game begins as a group of rebels is slaughtered by the Armed Volunteers. Now Achi says it's Michiko's group, so we can assume that this PNG image is Michiko. The hero team was planning on commandeering a transport ship to smuggle the other rebels out of the city. Even though they're all dead now, they still go ahead with the plan. Hey, I mean, they put the plan together. I mean, it would be a waste of time not to follow through, right? When they arrive at the transport, they are confronted by the Bird Queen, a giant ruffian who is actually not a ruffian, but a former scientist that Brad shared his blood with, which caused the transformation. Now, what exactly sharing blood means? I mean, hell if I know. Maybe it's a sex thing, or maybe it's just a weird translation of a Japanese phrase. Regardless, Brad obviously had a fetish for sharing blood because he infected not one, not two, but 3 separate women. After Radan is subdued by Saki, Kachua, another scientist and member of the Armed Volunteers, reveals that she too is a member of Brad's monster woman harem. She probably has the most ridiculous boss fight in the game, which is saying a lot. Now this is when shit gets weird. Yeah, I know what I said. After Kachua is defeated, Japan is flooded by a sea of blood for some reason, and Saki is caught in the maelstrom. But, surprise, as it turns out, Achi also shared her blood with Saki. Damn man, on top of the monster invasion and the blood flood, Japan also has a public health nightmare brewing. Achi's blood causes Saki to transform into a kaiju, but Brad's blood also causes Kachua to go kaiju. I mean, this is a Japanese game, so you should have seen a kaiju battle coming at some point. Saki kicks Kachua's ass for the second time. That was incredibly hard for me to say, by the way. But unfortunately for Iron and Achi, he is berserk in this form. A quick side note, the English voice performances are a little lackluster, not necessarily because the voice actors are bad, though Saki's voice actor probably should have finished puberty before they cast him.
Good morning, Iron.
But because they're trying to match the pacing of the original Japanese cutscenes, I'm actually just going to let this cutscene play out for you.
We can't go near him yet.
Is that Saki?
Can change him back, okay? Just not now.
We're the only ones left. Everyone else is dead.
Damn it!
So since Achi is basically God, she is able to teleport her and Iron away from Saki's wrath to the safest place, which is Brad's flagship. It's at this point that we realize Brad was also once a disciple of Achi, meaning that she was the true patient zero for the transformative kaiju STD. We're also introduced to Leda, the third member of Brad's harem, who, well...
Thinking of revenge?
Embittered because Achi's Pokemon beat his Pokemon, he directs his forces to kill Saki, claiming he is the new major threat to Japan, which, to be fair to Brad, he's not exactly wrong about. In a few minor setbacks, Iron confronts Brad on the bridge in a pretty neat gimmick boss fight. Now Achi taunts Brad for, quote-unquote, trying to make friends by passing his blood, but we all know what he was really trying to do. Also, Leda's dead. Anyway, who cares about all that? It's jet surfing time. Ignore everything else I've said about this game. If there is one reason you should play Sin and Punishment for yourself, it's this stage. Seriously, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with a cooler setting. I mean, Iron destroys the functional equivalent of the entire US Navy by herself while surfing through the air on a piece of sheet metal. Saki might be the main character, but Iron is the cool character. In one final confrontation with Brad, he decides that rather than transform, he'd rather die with his troops and remain human. I'm sure all his men who were drowning and burning to death really appreciated that sentiment. But the armed volunteers are not finished yet, as they send what is basically a Star Destroyer in to finish Saki off. Unable to destroy it in time, it launches a ballistic missile to take Saki down once and for all. An unstoppable harbinger of death. It's reminiscent of the words from the Bhagavad Gita, spoken by J. Robert Oppenheimer after the detonation of the atomic bomb. I am become death, destroyer. Oh wait, Iron just shot that down too. Now is where the story begins to take a turn. Machi claims that Iron needs to touch Saki's heart in order to transform him back into a human. No, that is not a metaphor. She wants Iron to shoot Saki in the forehead as an anesthetic so they can open up his chest and Iron can crawl in. Reasonably skeptical of this plan, she begins doubting Achi's motives, to which Achi responds by sending Iron on a psychic trip to the future, where she's standing on a train with a mysterious child. Iron's maternal instincts kick in.
Shut up!
And she slowly realizes that this child is her son, and that this is a vision of things to come if Saki doesn't transform back. Though, understanding the situation was not Achi's goal, she just wanted to trick Iron into shooting her gun at Saki. So hey, guess what? Achi's evil now! This scene really gives you a bit of whiplash, as she just straight up comes on and says she was manipulating the rebels to engineer a conflict across Japan as a sort of baby's first catastrophe, before engulfing the entire world in a global war. See, Achi has these enemies that are some nebulous cosmic entities that we don't get to be privy to, and she needs to destroy the Earth and replace it with a replica of her own making. As for Saki, her designs for him are for him to serve under her as a god of war that can rule the chaos of this new Earth. But in order for Saki to be able to control his kaiju form, he needs to become more powerful as a human. With that, she throws Iron into the heart of the beast, again, literally, in an attempt to snap Saki back into his senses. But lest we forget, Saki is part Achi now, and was able to inherit some of her powers, including teleportation. So, they zoom away to a safe place. Which, again, is probably the least safe place at the time. This time they warp to Hokkaido, the original site of the Ruffian research projects, which is predictably now Ruffian Central. But Achi isn't far behind, and while Saki is distracted, she kidnaps Iron as an experiment to test Saki's resolve. So, we finally arrived at the final boss. What would you expect from a final boss in a game this unhinged? Another giant kaiju battle? How about a face-off with Achi as she summons ruffians to swarm the battlefield? No, you're not thinking big enough. As the final boss, we face off against a literal copy of Earth. Now this is a pretty cool cinematic battle. Your job is to reflect all the debris Earth 2 is raining down on Earth 1 back at Earth 2, simultaneously dealing damage but also protecting the pathetically fragile Earth 1. Seriously, Earth 1 can't take shit. Achi might have a point that it's time for a replacement. Eventually, Earth 2 is defeated, and Achi is doomed to float away into space until the sequel, and the world is saved. Well, except for Japan. Japan is fucked. But the game ends on an optimistic note, as Saki and Iron embrace amongst the ruin, believing that as long as they stick together, there's hope for the planet. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that the writing is a masterpiece and that it deserves a Nobel Prize in Literature for its deconstruction of the Messiah as a hero. But the setting is cool, and the beat-by-beat action is fun enough. I mean, not every story needs to be fucking Finnegan's Wake. The last thing I want to mention about the game is the music. Now you've been listening to it this whole video, so I don't think I need to tell you how fantastic it is. But I do want to give a shout out to my homie, Toshio Yamanaka, who composed the work. As you can hear, he don't miss. It seems like he's left the video game music scene, but let's all take a shot in remembrance for the excellent work he did on this game. So in my original draft, I had a long concluding segment waxing philosophic about the nature of creativity and how older games just hit differently than modern games. But it turned into Sap City. And let's be real, if you clicked on this video, you don't need me to lecture you on the value of older games. So rather, I'm just gonna leave you with this.
Everyone else is dead.
Damn it!